First off, let me introduce myself. My name is Dr. Justin Mallett. My preferred pronouns are he, him, and his, and I am the Assistant Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion here at Northwest. And so on behalf of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, we would like to say thank you for coming and thank you for attending this presentation as part of our Black History Month series. The theme for Black History Month this year is Black Health and Wellness, and so we've been very fortunate to be able to have some great events related to Black Health and Wellness, including last week with our movie night, looking at Homer G. Phillips Hospital down in St. Louis. Tonight we're going to have Dr. Mercy Dixon come and speak to all of us. Dr. Dixon works here at in Maryville in the emergency room, and I'll do a bio for her in a second. But we also have a great partnership with Mosaic as it relates to diversity and inclusion. So I think it was probably three or 4 months ago, we came into a partnership with Mosaic Life Care, where we are partnering up on diversity and inclusion initiatives. So they have a diversity and inclusion committee that branches out not only here in Maryville, but also in St. Joe and Albany. And so part of that task is, it looked a little creepy for a second. I was like, no. So part of that is our office, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, we go in and we provide trainings on various topics such as implicit bias and microaggressions. And then Mosaic also provides support for us to provide programming on campus as it relates to things within the medical field and other things related to diversity and inclusion. So this is the part of a great partnership. So Dr. Dixon is here to also share knowledge with us. So a little bit about Dr. Mercy Dixon. Dr. Mercy Dixon is in some ways a recovering idealist, bitten by the wanderlust bug, and in turn sharing the ways that it shifted her perspective on health, finance, and life. Dr. Dixon is an emergency medicine physician with the MBA, an interest in global emergency medicine, personal finance, and personal freedom. She feels strongly in the right for all of us to live a life that is rich, healthy, and vibrant. Hence her passion for inclusion, diversity, non-oppressive practices, and health. Dr. Dixon was the co-director of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for the Department of Emergency Medicine in her final year of residency. Dr. Dixon also aims to expand the ways we view the world and our place in it as both privileged and disadvantaged, believing we mostly have some stake in each pie. So if everybody wouldn't mind giving a large Northwest welcome for Dr. Mercy Dixon.
All right, I must be honest, I did not expect this many people. So as someone who's learning that they're a extroverted introvert, this is a little bit of a much. But I think what I really want to say is you really should give yourself a pat on the back for being here. It always brings me great joy to see young people showing up just to learn about each other, because how else are we going to love on each other, grow as people, and just kind of live in a world that allows us to just be, if we're not having these conversations and being open to listening to them and learning from each other. So I just want to say thank you for showing up today. It does not go over my head that you're here. All right. So first I will start with saying thank you to Dr. Justin Mallett, Ms. Sarah Juarez. All of you have worked in the forefront and in the background to make this possible. And like I said, all of you here today, I say thank you. I'm glad to be here amongst you all today. So a little bit of background. I went to secondary school in northern Nigeria with classmates from various ethnic backgrounds, many of whom shared a similar skin color. Our cultures were sometimes similar, sometimes starkly different, yet I don't want to remember getting into a fight with anyone because of what language they spoke, where they came from, or their religion. It definitely occurred, and it still occurs. I just never personally experienced it. My friends didn't all share my religion or beliefs either. This kind of day-to-day reality was in contrast to the religious riots that sometimes plagued our city. The first time someone I knew went missing after one of these riots, never to be seen again, I was shocked. The second time was surprising but less shocking. It was unclear to me as a young girl how I could have both Christian and Islamic religious studies offered as classes at school, walk and laugh with many Muslim friends, share snacks at school, and bond over making fun of our teachers. And somehow, this difference in religion was used as the catalyst for killings in our community. There was a sort of disconnect between my experiences with those I knew personally of different religious backgrounds and the deadly unrest among Christians and Muslims in my community that sometimes surrounded us. As I entered my teenage years, I wondered where and who decided we were so different and couldn't live together in peace. But I also began to hear, or perhaps listen more, as grievances were voiced about political and religious issues. What I have come to learn is that when a person or group of people have had enough of what they believe to be an infringement on their rights, it is difficult to maintain the spirit of let's all get along. A phrase said in one form or another when Black people or minorities voice grievances about their experiences in the United States. So I've been invited here to talk as a physician on Black History Month. So I'll do what I can to discuss race and healthcare in a relatively short period of time. For some, parts of this talk might be heavy. For others, it will be familiar. And for some others, it will bring up a range of feelings. My hope is that you will be willing to acknowledge that we're humans, constantly learning and growing, and are allowed a spectrum of feelings. We sometimes as people have a tendency to want to throw away, lock up, and even direct our feelings and discomfort at others. Avoid doing that if you can. In the era of performative outrage, mouth service, increasing labeling, and silencing, it is important that we have honest discussions. We can't do that if we keep trying to sweep the past under a rug without truly healing as a nation. Racism, colonialism, microaggression, implicit bias. These are hot topics in our climate today. It can seem like if you drop the R word, a bomb of highly potent allergens fill the air. You might wonder if folks will develop rashes as you observe the visceral reactions it can elicit in people. With reason. This country has its fair share of complex, painful, and even some evil racial relations that fester long after slavery has been abolished. So how did we get here? Now, although I experienced major culture shock when I attended college, I was lucky to have attended a historically Black college and university. It was there that I had some important conversations and took classes that provided more information about Black history not readily available in the history books I read in high school. Interestingly, my views were starkly different in college from those around me, and didn't change much until years after college. It was the beginning of my understanding of health disparities based on race. How did these disparities come to be, and how can we decrease the racial gaps? All right, let's talk race. So what is race? How did I get to be black with no true black anything that I know of on my body? Dark brown maybe, but black is questionable. Who was that meant to benefit? Beliefs that blacks and whites are fundamentally and biologically different have been prevalent in various forms for centuries. Prior to the colonial era, race was utilized to describe people of the same kin or ancestry. And it wasn't until the colonial era in the 16th and 17th century that race began to be utilized as a way to describe physical features. The Enlightenment Era, also known as the Age of Reason, occurred during this time. It is then ironic that a primary belief of the enlightened white men of the era was that reason would lead to freedom and progress, yet utilized race to describe physical features to justify slavery of black people. The first wave of colonialism had taken off during this era. Generally, colonialism forces culture and language on another population, expanding the encroaching country's influence through setting of colonies. The transatlantic slave trade was a significant component of the colonial era, bringing African slaves, mainly from Central and West Africa, to America, including the US. Through the transatlantic slave trade, slavery came with added conditions, because we all know that wasn't the first time they had slavery in the world. This time, though, was different. Not only were these black slaves going to be slaves for life, their offsprings would also inherit slavery and be considered property. In order to appease those who found moral issue with slavery, the introduction of race was strategically utilized to label who would have human rights and who would not. It was easier to justify the wrongs against black people if they were considered less than human and an inferior race. Slave owners, scientists, physicians, including the likes of John H. Van Every, who championed pseudoscientific belief that there was a scientific evidence to justify slavery and the inhumane treatment of black people in medicine and in research. Over centuries, colonial and racist ideologies created systems, even after the abolishment of slavery, through things such as the Jim Crow era here in the United States, that intentionally created a healthcare system that was built specifically to keep black people from getting optimal healthcare. Why then should we be surprised that racial disparities exist in healthcare because of our systems? Some examples. Black women are 2 to 3 times more likely to die than non-Hispanic whites from pregnancy-related causes. And education does not improve these outcomes. It actually increases by 5.2 times. Black infants are 2 times more likely to die than non-Hispanic whites, regardless of socioeconomic or education status. There are higher rates of pre-existing conditions such as hypertension and diabetes in black people. To add, those identifying as blacks are more likely to die of all causes at all ages. Let's look at academic medicine for a sec. Academic medicine teaches that race is a risk factor. If black includes African American blacks, Nigerians, some South Africans, Do the Aborigines count? Do the darkest skinned Indians count? So where does race play a role factor as a risk factor? When do we start taking accountability for the racist and/or dangerously biased nature of how we teach and approach race in our medical decision making? Black Americans are prescribed less pain medications than white patients. Pair this with a 2016 study and other studies where 40% of first and second year medical students thought Black people have thicker skin and thus felt less pain. So it's 2016. Similar findings we're seeing in studies involving pain management by pediatricians. They have also observed that as the strength of provider implicit bias favoring whites increased, the likelihood of prescribing appropriate pain medication decreased only for Black people. Black patients are 22% less likely than white patients to receive any pain medication. What is scary is that providers may not even be aware they have these implicit biases. Marian Sims, considered the father of modern gynecology, practiced surgical procedures on enslaved women, reported to have been done about 30 on just one slave named Anakar alone. These surgeries were performed without anesthesia, since it wasn't yet widespread at the time. These ideas don't seem too far from modern day thoughts that Black people have thicker skin and thus feel less pain. Studies also show that beliefs on the biology of race is associated with greater acceptance of racial disparities. Take another example. There is evidence against, and at the very least, weak evidence for the guidelines for which generations of doctors have utilized to prescribe a narrow range of blood pressure medications to Black patients. Race-based prescribing of these medications may be detrimental to Black people in the long run, but we continue to do it. There are instances in healthcare when it is important to consider disease prevalence. It can give us insight when the data is utilized correctly. Although we are 99.9% similar in our genetic makeup, as humans across all races, it is not completely 100%. But we must use this data responsibly and avoid utilizing it to perpetuate biases and health disparities on the basis of race. We know healthcare disparities based on race exist. We know our healthcare system is flawed, not just for Black people, but for poor whites too, for poor people in general. And that's just among some other groups. We also know Black people carry a disproportionate rate of these disparities. Some have suggested and argued in our time that other minority groups seem to make larger leaps despite adversities, and so should Black people. These are vaguely similar to arguments made by the likes of Thomas Jefferson in his time when he said, and made comparisons to what Blacks were not capable of compared to white people or other minority groups. It is not that Blacks need to do better or that ideology is completely false. That's not the issue. The grave issue is that it is one-sided. It heavily places blame on the wronged and often minimizes the nuances of Black history in America, including how groups arrived and how much effort was put into developing a system with the intention to oppress and exclude Black people. We are quick to tell the Black community to move on from their history, but have a hard time moving on from the comfortable, permeating scent of celebrations of white history throughout our culture. It also very importantly fails to acknowledge the great strides African Americans have made despite all odds. I will list a few historical figures who have contributed a great deal to healthcare and medicine in the US, not letting it go over our heads that everyday brilliant, intelligent, wealthy, creative Black people contribute to the advancement of our society. Some examples: Charles Drew. He is considered founder of blood banking in the US. He went to Howard Medical School, a historically Black medical school. He served as director of the American Red Cross Blood Bank, but quit when the Red Cross insisted on segregating African American blood. Clive Callender. He was the first African American transplant surgeon. He championed for access of transplant for minorities. Prior to him, access was even worse for minorities. LaSalle Lafole Jr. was the first African American president of the American College of Surgery. James Durham. He was born into slavery in 1762, learned how to read and write, learned from several physicians who owned him through childhood. He bought his freedom and opened a medical practice in New Orleans, where he cared for patients of all racial backgrounds. He did not have a formal medical degree, but he was successful in treating patients with diphtheria and saved many patients during the yellow fever outbreak in 1789. There are modern day heroes like Camara Phyllis Jones, who has done tremendous work in public health. James Mccoon Smith. He was an abolitionist born into slavery in 1813, denied admission to American colleges, but was able to attend the University of Glasgow in Scotland. He was the first African American doctor to practice medicine with a medical degree in the US. He treated both Black and white patients. Rebecca Lee Crumpler was the first Black female physician in the US. She also worked as a nurse prior to college. Patricia Bath was the first African American to complete an ophthalmology residency and the first African American female doctor to receive a medical device patent for her probe, which was used in cataract treatment. Dr. Daniel Hale Williams. He opened the First Nations Black-owned interracial hospital in 1891, offering training to African American interns and established America's first school for Black nurses. He performed the first successful open heart surgery on a human. He was also the co-founder of the National Medical Association and first Black physician admitted to the American College of Surgeons. As an aside, as I looked up Dr. Williams, a medical journal credited the first open heart surgery that was successful to a white physician who performed the surgery after Dr. Williams' procedure. We still have a ways to go in crediting the work of Black people in history. Harriet Tubman, the famed Underground Railroad conductor and former slave, who was also a nurse during the Civil War. She tended to Black soldiers and liberated slaves. She created the Harriet Tubman Home for Aged and Indigent Negroes in 1908. Belle Tums was a nurse who successfully lobbied for Blacks to serve as American Red Cross nurses in World War I. She spent 18 years acting as director of nursing at Lincoln Hospital in New York, but her race precluded her from being given the actual title. Otis Boykin, he developed electronics components that made the production of TV and computers more affordable and became best known for improving the pacemaker, a device that uses electrical impulses to help maintain people's regular heart rate. And lastly, but certainly not least, Dr. Jane Cook Wright, whose work played a role in taking chemotherapy from last resort medication to a viable treatment for cancer. There are many more that I did not name. Black people are not a monolith. No type of people are. There are criminals, heroes, intellectuals, and plain old dumbasses within the Black culture, just like any other culture. Using one type of person within the group to further an agenda is not fair. We can acknowledge that there are privileged Black people, both who were born into privilege and those who worked their way out despite all odds, while also acknowledging that many Black Americans face systems with infrastructures built with the intention to keep them oppressed and undervalued. We can praise and acknowledge progress while calling out what needs to be improved. We can acknowledge the poor working white class and that our systems fail them too, while acknowledging the plights of Black poor and the role of our history in that. The same way we can agree that women, disabled, trans, and so on face challenges as well. That those conversations should be had as well, and that we ought to continue to find ways to address those challenges too. So we have made and continue to make progress, but there's still a way to go. I hope that as we open ourselves up to having honest conversations about the nation's uncomfortable past and work collectively to heal, Black history will focus less heavily on the suffering of Black people and will continue to celebrate all the wondrous meanings of being Black, whatever Black means. That we will discuss Africa and Black people in ways that celebrate their intellect, uniqueness, and power. We won't get there without honest discourse. Our culture of silencing and dismissing is dangerous. Dismissing the experiences of a people risks relieving the evil parts of history. We are on a pendulum of extremes, or at least the noisemakers allowed that pendulum to swing from one far end to the other, and the rest of us silently watching the flames carried from one end to the other. We need balance. So, do we need to decolonize healthcare? Are our healthcare systems racist infrastructures? Are we simply succumbing to natural biases? It is important that we have these discussions while leaving room for nuanced perspectives, allowing each other to learn, to grow, and pivot as needed. Some ways we can begin to make these shifts include just collecting data, get the information. We need to learn history. Also, we need to provide a more balanced look at history for the general population, so we can become more aware of where we come from, what we can correct, and what to avoid repeating. This includes educating ourselves on the advancements Black people have made in history and in our current day. Support Black businesses and ideas. No, this does not mean blindly supporting, and no, it does not mean you should stop supporting white businesses. Honesty with oneself is also important. as you evaluate your own ideologies and beliefs. We need to realize that Western approaches to healthcare and medical care are not the end-all, be-all of best practices. Black people will need to continue to better build themselves and for themselves. We need to find ways to do what you can to work to change the system for the better, because you're more powerful than you think. We need to restructure the way we teach medicine and healthcare in terms of race. We as providers in medicine should learn about where these disparities exist. You as a patient should learn about where these disparities exist so you can know when you see them. And then we need to be intentional in our efforts to, at the very least, not perpetuate them. So we know, based on research, that patients' outcomes are better when they are seen by physicians from the same backgrounds and physicians who look like them. So we need to do better about improving the disparities in the number of Black physicians. Only 2.5% of Black physicians of all physicians, are Black female. Similar numbers for Black male physicians. There is some good news. We make some progress and have been making progress in the rate of matriculation of women into medical school. But these increases are mainly in white and Asian women. And it's important to remember that the rates for matriculation into medical school for Black men have been stagnant. I'll give an example of, and I speak of this very specifically for medical school for physicians. But looking at dentistry, there's, in 2020, 65 dental schools within the US. And a historically Black college and university was responsible for 42% of the Black males being graduated in our entire country. How does that make sense? As I looked for medical schools, and especially as I looked for residencies, it was not unusual to go to programs and look 3 years down and not see a Black face in any of those classes. How is that in 2020? For me, that was 2018. So I say, we've got work to do. I'm Black and I'm proud. Yes, I understand the nuances that both created the disparities that make Black people feel the need to encourage each other and themselves with that statement, as well as the privilege that allows me to say that out loud as opposed to my white friends. I look forward to a world where I do not need to provide a reminder to young Black people that they matter and should be proud of the skin color they were born in. I look forward to a world where we can significantly reduce health disparities. Thank you.
First off, thank you again, Dr. Dixon, for sharing those words with us. And so now we have some time for question and answer. So if you have any questions specifically for Dr. Dixon, if you wouldn't mind just standing up and utilizing your voice to ask.
And I'll preface by saying, now that the official talk is done, we live in a world where it's so hard to speak your mind. And because you say something and you're afraid, like, what if I say the wrong thing? Am I gonna look racist? Am I racist? And we're so quick to jump on each other and attack each other for just thinking. of being bold enough to just say something out loud. And that's not to say that I am giving excuses for the extreme words on either end of a conversation or an issue. But I think you guys are, and ladies, are the ones that, and other, are the ones that are going to change that. You know, you're the ones that are going to give each other permission to be honest. Because how else are we going to grow? And I talked in the talk about how I was in college, and my thought processes and my beliefs were completely different in college, and not until a few years outside of college did I start having different ideas of what it means to be Black or Black American. And that would just be a conversation that can go on till tomorrow. But I was fortunate enough to be able to be wrong and have these conversations, which unfortunately I think as we get into the era of everything is on Twitter and everybody wants to be a keyboard warrior, I think that's the word now they call it, that it's hard to say the things that I was free to say in college and have people say, no, I don't agree and this is why. So my thoughts on race did not just get here. I did not believe what I believe all of a sudden. And I think I just want to encourage you to be bold, to encourage other people to speak up, even if you don't agree with them. Because it's there that we can have conversations with each other and grow with each other. So I just want to, say, I encourage you to speak up, and I have faith in you that you guys are the ones that are, and ladies, like I said, and are going to be the ones to change things for us. So, questions? Yes, ma'am.
So how do we, from our generation, what are things that we can do to start implementing change?
Yeah, so that's a loaded question. It's a good one, and I think that's where we need to start asking those questions. So I think first place that's easy to start is just talk, right? I had a nurse. I like giving examples just because it's easier. I had a nurse who came up to me and say, "So, Dr. Dixon, can we say blacks? Can we do how would you like to be called? Black African American? Is it offensive to say black people?" And these are things that some people are afraid to even ask, right? Because you ask it and it's like, how am I going to be viewed? But I think that it's important that we approach these questions as much as we can from give the benefit of a doubt that we're all trying to learn. So to answer your question, I would say have conversations and try to be the one that offers grace in conversations so that the next person might not do the same. But what that does for you is it allows you to hear someone's point of view that is probably completely different from yours. Either it changes your mind, some or all, right? Or it reaffirms what you believe and gives you further motivation to continue to look for ways to change the system. I don't think there's any losing in that. So that's what I would say. Talking to each other honestly is one way to do it. Second is, in whatever you're in college, you're picking what you want to do now. So I'd say whatever you're choosing to do, look into that. In my role as a social worker, if you're studying social work, where are disparities within my line of work that I'm interested in? How can I start to play a role in that? Can I just sit down with my clients and just ask a question? Hey, tell me about yourself. You'd be surprised how many people want to just talk and how much you can learn from that. And then I think becoming more involved in politics is important. Not everybody is interested in that. But these are the places that decisions get made for the population. So I think that it is multifactorial. I don't think that there is one answer. I think that we have certainly come a long way, but we're not out of the woodwork. So if you see someone that is saying things in a way that further perpetuates racism or prejudice, because not all prejudice is quote unquote racist, right? that you speak up, but try to do it in a place of listening. So I don't know, that's what I would recommend. Start small, and if you have access to big, go big.
Do you think that the racial disparities that you were talking about in medicine earlier, and how these numbers are so different for white people versus Black Americans, do you think that plays a role in how they're calculating the risk factor, and then is it just like a cycle that's like going in a circle of like, because they're more likely to be like dying of these sort of things, then is that like more of the risk factor, and then are they not getting treatment because of that, and then it just kind of is a vicious cycle?
Let me see if I understand your question. Are you asking if by having health disparities, the outcome of that kind of feeds into perpetuating it? Like, is that what you're asking me?
Kind of, yeah.
You said kind of, is that not what I'm?
I mean, because you're talking about risk factors and how when like African Americans and Blacks are more likely to have all of these different things, and then it's hard to
Take your
explain.
time, it's okay.
Since they're more likely to have all of these things, and then I don't know. I think what you were saying, yes, like how you phrased my question.
Okay.
That way.
So I think that it's nuanced, yes. So, for example, let's back up a little bit, right? When we sit here and we say we're going to the city, I imagine some of you, much of you have been to some city, and you're like, oh, that place is ghetto, right? Who lives in the ghetto? Mostly Black people, minorities, Hispanics, right? That's not taken away from the fact that we have a good amount of poor Blacks poor whites who live in dire environments as well, right? But if we're just taking percentages to percentage, that's what we're seeing. So when you put people in environments where they don't make enough money, right? And I don't know how many of you have heard of food deserts. They can't get to healthy foods in a way that's reliable and in a way that's cost effective for them. Then you perpetuate these health disparities, right? As you get these increased percentages of these diseases within the minority communities, they're more likely to die from these diseases, right? As you're more likely to die from these diseases, one could argue, because this part of it, I think, is more just sort of my own addition to what could be going on, is you further perpetuate that, right? And cause that cycle to continue. So if you never actually say, how can we pull our fellow humans from this situation, it doesn't end, right? So there's not one solution, but yes, I think lack begets lack. So as you create these disparities in healthcare, yes, people are going to die, and yes, it only makes things worse. But speaking of which, that brings me to, so I think we need to learn how to have nuanced conversation. So having conversations like saying, we don't know if that's the only factor, right? We don't know if racism for this one group is all there is. Maybe our system just sucks too and is inefficient, and then there are aspects of those that play a role, right? But we have to start somewhere, right? We know there are health disparities because of race. Let's start there, right? It doesn't mean we can't see the other things, like we know that our system spends and pushes money towards the wrong things, and that's not helping. So I think we just need to be honest about how all of these things play a role, and not just only point at one thing all the time. So I think I answered 2 questions there, but I tried to see if I could answer it appropriately. Yes, ma'am.
What brought you to Maryville?
That's a good question. And then someone asked me this earlier. So a number of things. I'm interested in global health and global EM, emergency medicine specifically. So I always knew I was going to practice in a smaller town. One, because we have a broad spectrum of what we can practice as emergency medicine physicians, like the procedures we can do. Certainly we don't do surgeries, but there are procedures that we can do. I went to my residency was a tertiary center, so we had any and everything you can think of, ophthalmology, neuro-ophthalmology. So anytime we had a patient and it was busy, we could just call them down for that specific case and have them do it. The beauty of doing more community medicine is that you don't always have access to that right away, and you can still practice within your scope more than you might have done otherwise when it's easier to just call someone down. So for me, it was being able to have more hands-on experience and take that to my interest in global health. So ultimately, the hope is to practice in places that don't have as much resources, so I would have to pull in from experiences like a small town to be able to do that. And then the other answer is money. So as a physician, a lot of people come out with a significant amount of debt, and for me, it's also part of the strategy is being able to go where I was likely to pay off my debts and be free to practice medicine in a way that was in alignment with my goals and the freedom to do that. And it's quiet. Well, I don't know if college kids think it's adults, I'm sorry. I think I just aged myself there, but if you guys think it's quiet in college, but Maryville is relatively quiet. Yes, ma'am.
This is kind of a more personal question.
Sure.
You don't have to answer if you wanted to, but with getting your degree, have you personally experienced racial discrimination? And then if you did or didn't, how would you respond to something like that?
That's a good question. So, yes. This is back to that whole beliefs in college being different from as when I came out. So the answer is yes. I don't know any Black resident, and I'm sure there are, that I personally have met who hasn't faced some kind of microaggression or blatant macroaggression meets racism. And I have lots of stories to tell, but I think that I try, and I'm human, but the goal is to start off saying this person is having a bad day, period. They're having a terrible day, they would have done this to anybody. I think that's the starting point. But I think that the more you experience certain things, you start to realize the patterns, and you start to understand the difference between someone having a bad day and the mixture of where microaggression, racism, and all of that comes into play. How I have dealt with it is it truly depends on the situation. I think that it is, most of the times I will call it out. And I think maybe this is because I'm Nigerian. I have no qualms telling people what I think, with reason, obviously. But I think that it's important to be honest and call people out. I try to do that with grace as much as I can. But as I see it, I call it out. Sometimes it's going to be harder to call it out because it's more microaggression, and you both know what's going on. But it's hard to put that in words. And I think those are the ones that are harder to deal with. So it's about educating those around you to know what that looks like. And put, be part of making change. So I try to join our DEI, the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee, as co-chair, as one way of being part of changing the system. So I would say, call it out when you see it. If you don't feel comfortable calling it out, go to someone who you trust to help you address the situation. And yeah. Yes, sir.
Talked about policy changes and getting involved in politics. What positive changes have you seen in this last, say, decade? And what are some major policy changes you would like to see in the future to help solve this issue?
Oh, I like it. So I think that I'm neither, I don't have a political affiliation, but I like to say that we can at least try to see the positive in attempts for positive change. So there are arguments for both sides for the Affordable Care Act, but I think that part of the positive in that is that it gave our socioeconomically disadvantaged members of society access that they might not have otherwise, especially if you don't really fall into the whole Medicare, Medicaid, and you're somewhere, which I think a lot of Americans are, right? That working class that can't quite afford care. I think that's one thing. And I also think that changes that I've seen is with, and this seems little, right? The changes that allowed our black girls to show up to school with their braids, right? And I think that those are little progress that we can, and steps forward in society that we can make to change how we look at each other. I remember when I was in medical school and starting to apply for residency, and a advisor told me that I should consider putting my hair straight so that I would be viewed as more professional and it would improve my chances for getting in. Because I had my natural hair. And this is, we're moving forward in this, but I think policy changes like that help make it so that Black women and in many ways minorities don't have to stop being who they are from a biological standpoint, so that they can be considered professional. So those are some changes that I think have occurred. There's a lot of changes that happens within emergency medicine as well, that I'm proud of. But those would be those would be two of the ones that at least I can think off the top of my head. I'm sure once I leave here, some will come. Yes.
In the Black community, there is a lot of distrust of medicine, at least historically. And I was wondering if you could comment on whether or not you feel that is contributing to the lack of Blacks going into medicine. And if you think it is a contributing factor, how do we fix that?
So I actually think it has less to do with Blacks going into medicine and more on the patient end of things. I say that because of the number that of applicants that are Black that medical schools and residency receive. They get a ton of them. There's not literally a lack of people wanting to go into medical school. There's a lack of people getting accepted into medical school. Does that make sense? Now there's a drop off with Black males specifically though that happens after medical school and within matriculation into residency. So there's that. There's, again, back to nuance, right? It's not all just like tongue-in-cheek black and white. There is nuance there, but I think that we don't have a problem as much getting Black people interested in medicine. I think there is an issue with getting people interested in STEM. That includes Black people, and I'm sure there are some, I don't know the data, so I don't want to say that I do in terms of, but there's a disparity on people who go into STEM, period, across the board. And I'm sure there, I imagine there's some disparity within Blacks. But taking all of that, we have a lot of Black people that want to go into medical school, that apply for medical school, they just don't get accepted. So I think that ultimately that's more an issue of our history. So I talk about this gets brought up every time, right? Tuskegee experiment, Henrietta Lacks. We can go on and on and on about things that our nation has done to Black people that has kind of fostered this distrust in medicine. And that only gets further perpetuated when we look at numbers about how you can be an educated, well-off Black woman and your risk of dying from pregnancy-related risk factors are higher. And we have to look into that and see why that is, right? So I think of like stories from my own patients I've heard when they go into a doctor, they tell them their problem, they're dismissed, right? So they go see someone who looks like them, they pay a little more close attention, this is what they find. Little everyday interactions like that play a big role in my opinion. And if we think of it as a nationwide disparity, that means that this is occurring across the nation when people go to their doctor in New York, or go to their doctor in Maryville, or go to their doctor in Texas, right? So all of these things, we're humans, we talk. We pass these things on from generation to generation. We think about this Tuskegee happened in what, 1970s, right? What was the tail end of that? So like 1930s, 1970s. These people are, their family members who sat with them are alive and talking about these at the dinner table. So these get passed on from generation to generation, and that loss of distress goes on for generation to generation. So to answer your question, I think it's more a problem with, on the patient side. Certainly we make it harder for Black people to go into medical schools, right? If you're already coming in from an environment where you're in a lower socioeconomic class, you have to think hard and yes, that's any poor or any less well off. You have to think hard about whether you want to take on that $250,000 loan for another 8 years versus just go in and do something else. So I think that it's probably more patient-based, but there are factors within our system that also makes it harder for Black people to consider it. All right.